Welcome, traveler of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. Medieval Europe was a world where invisible killers stalked every village, castle, and monastery, where the simple act of breathing could seal your fate, where entire bloodlines vanished overnight, and where the deceased often outnumbered the living. This wasn't a world conquered by armies or destroyed by natural disasters. This was a civilization under siege by microscopic enemies that no sword could defeat and no wall could keep out. The diseases that ravaged medieval Europe weren't just medical curiosities. They were forces of history that toppled kingdoms, ended dynasties, and reshaped the very fabric of society. They determined who lived to rule and who perished in obscurity. They decided which ideas survived and which knowledge was lost forever. In many ways, the story of medieval Europe is not the story of monarchs and knights, nobles and peasants, but the story of humanity's struggle against an invisible army of pathogens that showed no mercy to wealthy or impoverished alike. When we think of medieval death, we often imagine the battlefield, the clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, the desperate cries of warriors. But the truth is far more unsettling. For every person who perished by the sword, dozens more fell to diseases that struck without warning, spread without explanation, and killed without discrimination. These weren't just illnesses. They were apocalyptic events that could empty entire cities in weeks, leaving behind nothing but silence and the stench of mortality. The medieval world had no understanding of germs, no concept of contagion, and no defense against the biological warfare that nature waged against them daily. They lived in a time when a simple cut could lead to an agonizing death, when childbirth was a gamble with mortality, and when the very air they breathed could carry their doom. They attributed these calamities to divine wrath, to wrongdoing, to the alignment of celestial bodies, never knowing that their greatest enemies were creatures too small to see yet powerful enough to bring empires to their knees. Consider for a moment what it must have been like to wake up each morning not knowing if this would be the day that death came calling, to watch your children sleep and wonder if they would see another dawn, to kiss your spouse goodbye and realize it might truly be goodbye forever. This was the reality for millions of people across medieval Europe, living under the constant shadow of diseases that could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The deadliest diseases of medieval history weren't just medical phenomena. They were the invisible hands that shaped the course of human civilization. They determined which cities thrived and which became ghost towns. They influenced which trade routes flourished and which were abandoned. They decided which cultural movements spread and which perished in their cradles. Every major decision, every political alliance, every religious movement of the medieval period was made against the backdrop of omnipresent mortality. What makes these diseases so fascinating and unsettling is not just their lethality, but their complete indifference to human hierarchies. A monarch's crown offered no protection against the plague. A warrior's armor was useless against smallpox. A clergyman's prayers couldn't stop typhus. Death was the great equalizer, and disease was its most efficient servant. In the medieval world, your social status, your wealth, your power meant nothing when faced with microscopic killers that recognized no earthly authority. The impact of these diseases went far beyond the immediate horror of suffering and loss. They triggered massive social upheavals, economic collapses, and religious crises. that reverberated across centuries. When the Black Death killed a third of Europe's population, it didn't just create empty villages. It destroyed the feudal system, triggered peasant revolts, inspired new forms of art and literature, and fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with mortality. These diseases weren't just taking lives. They were rewriting the story of human civilization. But perhaps most chilling of all is how unprepared medieval society was for these biological catastrophes. They had no hospitals as we understand them, no public health systems, no scientific understanding of disease transmission. When plague struck, their response was often to pray harder, punish supposed wrongdoers more severely, or flee in panic. They were fighting a war they didn't understand against an enemy they couldn't see, using weapons that were utterly ineffective. The medical knowledge of the time was a dangerous mixture of ancient superstition, religious doctrine, and well-meaning ignorance. Physicians prescribed treatments that often killed faster than the diseases themselves. They bled patients who were already weak, poisoned them with mercury, and subjected them to procedures that would be considered barbaric today. In trying to heal, they often hastened death. In seeking the cure, they frequently spread contagion. Yet, even in this dark age of medicine, there were glimmers of understanding. Some medieval physicians began to notice patterns in disease outbreaks. They observed that certain conditions seemed to spread from person to person. They noticed that some locations were more dangerous than others. These early epidemiologists, working without microscopes or modern scientific methods, laid the groundwork for our current understanding of public health, often paying for their insights with their own lives. The deadliest diseases of medieval history also revealed the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Faced with horrors that would break modern societies, medieval people found ways to adapt, survive, and even thrive. They developed new forms of social organization. They created new economic systems. They found new ways to make meaning from suffering and hope from despair. Their survival is a testament to humanity's remarkable ability to endure even the darkest chapters of history. These diseases shaped not just how medieval people lived, but how they perished. Death in the medieval world was often public, communal, and deeply ritualized. When disease struck, entire communities would gather to pray, to mourn, to comfort the dying, and support the survivors. Death was not hidden away in hospitals and nursing homes, but was an ever-present part of daily life. This intimacy with mortality gave medieval culture a depth and urgency that is difficult for us to comprehend today. The economic impact of these diseases was staggering. Trade routes were abandoned when merchants feared contagion. Entire industries collapsed when their workers perished en masse. Agricultural production plummeted when farmers succumbed to plague. The wealth of nations rose and fell based not on military conquest or diplomatic skill, but on their ability to survive biological catastrophes. Disease was perhaps the most powerful economic force in medieval Europe, capable of destroying decades of prosperity in a matter of months. Religious institutions, which dominated medieval life, were forced to grapple with theological questions that had no easy answers. If the divine was benevolent and all-powerful, why did innocent children perish horribly from disease? If prayer and piety were protection against evil, why did the most devout often suffer the most? These diseases challenged fundamental beliefs about divine justice, human worth, and the nature of existence itself. They sparked religious reforms, inspired new theological movements, and sometimes shattered faith entirely. The deadliest diseases of medieval history also had profound effects on art, literature, and culture. The omnipresence of death inspired some of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. The haunting beauty of medieval religious art with its focus on suffering and redemption. The dark humor of medieval literature, which found laughter in the face of horror. the elaborate death rituals and memorial practices that created some of our most enduring cultural traditions. These diseases didn't just destroy, they also created, inspiring human creativity in the face of unimaginable loss. What's perhaps most remarkable about these medieval diseases is how they continue to influence our world today. Many of the public health measures we take for granted, quarantine, sanitation systems, disease surveillance, were first developed in response to medieval epidemics. The very concept of public health, the idea that governments have a responsibility to protect their citizens from disease, emerged from the ashes of medieval catastrophes. We are still living with the institutional and cultural legacy of humanity's medieval struggle against disease. Understanding these diseases also helps us appreciate how far we've come and how fragile our progress remains. The same pathogens that terrorized medieval Europe are still with us today. The difference is not that we've eliminated them, but that we've learned to control them through science, sanitation, and social organization. Yet, as recent global events have reminded us, we remain vulnerable to biological threats that can disrupt our societies in ways that would be familiar to any medieval chronicler. The deadliest diseases in medieval history were more than just medical emergencies. They were civilization-defining events that shaped everything from political structures to artistic expression, from economic systems to religious beliefs. They remind us that human history is not just the story of what we've built, but also the story of what we've survived. They show us that our ancestors faced challenges that would test the limits of human endurance and somehow found the strength to not just survive, but to create the foundations of the world we inhabit today. As we delve deeper into these dark chapters of human history, we'll discover that the medieval world's relationship with disease was complex, multifaceted, and ultimately transformative. These weren't just stories of death and suffering, but stories of adaptation, innovation, and the remarkable human capacity to find meaning and hope even in the darkest of circumstances. The deadliest diseases in medieval history didn't just take lives. They forged them, shaped them, and ultimately made us who we are today. In the shadowy corridors of medieval Europe, where the flickering flames of countless candles barely pierced the perpetual twilight, a silent war was being waged. Not between armies or kingdoms, but between humanity and the unseen forces of disease and death. As we continue our journey through the most devastating ailments that shaped the Middle Ages, we must now turn our attention to a collection of maladies that, while perhaps less notorious than the Black Death, nonetheless carved their own paths of destruction through the populations of Europe. The specter of disease in medieval times was not merely the stuff of nightmares. It was the harsh reality that governed every aspect of daily existence. From the moment a child drew their first breath in a world devoid of modern sanitation to the final moments when families gather around deathbeds in cramped, vermin-infested dwellings, illness was the unwelcome companion that shadowed every step of human life. These diseases did not discriminate. They struck down peasant and prince alike, though the poor, weakened by malnutrition and living in squalid conditions, bore the heaviest burden. In the fetid air of medieval cities, where human waste mingled with animal refuse in the narrow streets, and where the concept of hygiene was as foreign as the distant lands beyond the known world, disease found fertile ground to flourish. The very foundations of medieval society, its rigid class structure, its religious dogma, its primitive understanding of medicine, all conspired to create perfect conditions for epidemic after epidemic to ravage the continent. Consider, if you will, the plight of a typical medieval family during one of these outbreaks. Picture them huddled in their single-room dwelling, sharing their meager space with livestock whose warmth was essential for survival during the brutal winter months. The father, perhaps a blacksmith named Godric or a farmer named Oswin, would continue his labors even as fever racked his body, For the cease working meant starvation for his family. The mother, already weakened by frequent childbirth and poor nutrition, would tend to sick children with remedies passed down through generations, remedies that were more often harmful than helpful. The children themselves faced the most precarious existence of all, with infant mortality rates that would horrify modern sensibilities. It was considered remarkable if half of a family's children survived to adulthood. Those who did reach maturity bore the scars of their struggle: stunted growth from malnutrition, missing teeth from scurvy, and the pallor of those who had danced too often with death and somehow lived to tell the tale. But it was not merely the physical toll that these diseases extracted from medieval society. They fundamentally altered the very fabric of European civilization, shaping everything from religious practices to economic systems, from artistic expression to social hierarchies. When plague struck a community, it did not simply kill, it transformed. Villages that had thrived for centuries were abandoned overnight, their fields returning to wilderness, their churches standing empty as monuments to vanished congregations. The psychological impact was equally profound. In a world where life was already brutish and short, the constant threat of epidemic disease created a mindset of fatalistic acceptance, mixed with desperate superstition. People sought answers in the stars, in the humors of the body, in the supposed wrongdoings of their communities. They turned to prayer and pilgrimage, to bleeding and purging, to charms and amulets, anything that might offer protection against the invisible enemies that stalked them. Medieval medicine, such as it was, remained trapped in the amber of ancient Greek and Roman theories, mixed with a heavy dose of religious theology and folk wisdom. Physicians, when they could be found and afforded, prescribed treatments based on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed that disease was caused by an imbalance of these bodily fluids, and their treatments often involved bleeding, purging, or the administration of herbs and minerals that were as likely to harm as to heal. The very language used to describe illness reveals the medieval mindset. Diseases were often seen as punishments from the divine for individual or collective wrongdoing, or as tests of faith that the righteous must endure. This spiritual interpretation of illness meant that medical treatment was often intertwined with religious ritual, and that recovery was attributed more to divine intervention than to any earthly remedy. Yet within this framework of ignorance and superstition, there were glimmers of genuine medical knowledge. Monastery infirmaries served as repositories of healing wisdom, where monks carefully copied and preserved the medical texts of antiquity. These religious institutions often provided the only organized healthcare available to the common people, and their herb gardens supplied the raw materials for countless remedies. The monasteries also served as centers of medical learning, where the accumulated knowledge of generations was passed down from master to pupil. The role of women in medieval medicine cannot be overlooked. While formal medical education was reserved for men, women served as the primary caregivers in their communities. Midwives assisted in childbirth. Herbalists gathered and prepared medicinal plants, and countless mothers and wives nursed their families through illness with a combination of practical knowledge and tender care. These women, though often dismissed or even persecuted when their remedies failed, were in many ways the backbone of medieval healthcare. As we delve deeper into the specific diseases that plagued medieval Europe, we must remember that each outbreak was not merely a medical event, but a social, economic, and cultural catastrophe that rippled through every level of society. The diseases we will examine, from the mysterious sweating sickness that terrified Tudor England to the relentless march of leprosy that created an entire class of social outcasts, each tells a story not just of human suffering, but of human resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. These were times when a simple scratch could lead to death, when childbirth was a gamble with mortality, when the arrival of strangers in a town might herald not trade and news, but pestilence and death. Yet somehow, miraculously, civilization endured. People continued to love and laugh, to create and build, to hope and dream. Even as the shadow of disease darkened their doorsteps, the weapons they wielded against these invisible enemies were pitifully inadequate by modern standards. Prayers and purges, bleeding and burning, quarantine and superstition. Yet these medieval people possessed something that perhaps we have lost in our modern age of medical miracles, an acceptance of mortality that allowed them to find meaning and beauty in lives that were often brief and always uncertain. There, art reflected this preoccupation with death and disease. The dance macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic theme, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life, from popes to peasants, in a final equalizing dance. Churches were adorned with memento mori, reminders of death that urged the faithful to prepare their souls for the inevitable journey to the afterlife. Literature, too, was suffused with themes of mortality and the transience of earthly existence. The economic impact of these diseases was equally transformative. Labor shortages caused by epidemic mortality led to increased wages for survivors, contributing to the gradual breakdown of the feudal system. Trade routes were disrupted as merchants feared to travel to infected areas. Yet at the same time, the demand for luxury goods among the wealthy survivors created new opportunities for commerce. Entire industries, from textiles to agriculture, had to adapt to radically altered demographics. Religious life, too, was profoundly affected. The failure of prayers and pilgrimages to stem the tide of disease led some to question the established order of the church, while others doubled down on their faith, seeing suffering as a path to salvation. New religious movements emerged, some emphasizing personal piety and direct communion with the divine, others focusing on charitable works and care for the sick. The great cathedral building projects of the High Middle Ages gave way to smaller, more intimate religious foundations dedicated to caring for the diseased and dying. Perhaps most significantly, these diseases served as great equalizers in a society otherwise rigidly stratified by birth and wealth. A peasant's fever was indistinguishable from a lord's, and the grave made no distinction between the noble and the common. This shared vulnerability to disease created, paradoxically, both greater compassion for human suffering and a heightened awareness of social inequalities that would eventually contribute to social and political upheavals. The medieval response to epidemic disease also laid the groundwork for many modern public health practices. Quarantine, though often brutally enforced, represented an early understanding of contagion. The establishment of hospitals and infirmaries, initially by religious orders, created the institutional framework that would eventually evolve into modern healthcare systems. Even the primitive attempts at record-keeping during outbreaks contributed to the development of epidemiology. As we embark on this exploration of medieval diseases, we must steel ourselves for tales of almost unimaginable suffering. We will encounter symptoms so severe and mortality rates so high that they strain our modern comprehension. We will meet diseases with names that have passed from common knowledge: the king's evil, the falling sickness, the bloody flux, yet whose impact shaped the course of European history. But we will also discover stories of remarkable human endurance and ingenuity. We will learn of the brave souls who risked their lives to care for the sick, of the scholars who preserved and transmitted medical knowledge across generations, of the communities that found ways to support their most vulnerable members. Even in the darkest of times, the diseases we will examine in this continuation of our journey through medieval Medical history serve as windows into a world both alien and familiar. Alien in its acceptance of mortality and suffering as inevitable parts of human existence, yet familiar in its fundamental human responses to crisis, the search for meaning, the bonds of compassion, the stubborn refusal to surrender hope. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, these medieval maladies remind us that disease has always been humanity's companion, shaping not only our biology, but our culture, our societies, and our souls. In understanding how our ancestors confronted these challenges, we gain insight not only into the past, but into the enduring human condition itself. For while we may have conquered many of the diseases that terrorized medieval Europe, we continue to face new challenges that test our resolve, our compassion, and our ingenuity in ways that would be all too familiar to a medieval physician or a plague-stricken family. The story of medieval disease is ultimately the story of humanity itself, fragile yet resilient, mortal yet enduring, forever struggling against the forces that would destroy us, yet somehow finding the strength to build, to love, to hope, and to pass on to future generations the hard-won wisdom gleaned from our encounters with suffering and loss. Due to length constraints, I've provided the opening sections. The full 15,000 to 18,000 word version would continue with detailed explorations of specific diseases like leprosy, the sweating sickness, ergotism, tuberculosis, and others, maintaining the same calm, descriptive tone throughout. Would you like me to continue with specific sections? The medieval period was defined by relentless waves of disease that swept across Europe with terrifying regularity. While the Black Death of the 14th century stands as perhaps the most infamous pandemic in human history, it was merely one chapter in a centuries-long story of medical horror that shaped the very fabric of medieval society. Beyond the plague, a constellation of deadly ailments stalked the population with merciless persistence. Smallpox erupted in festering pustules across the skin, leaving survivors permanently scarred if they were fortunate enough to live. Typhoid fever ravaged communities through contaminated water sources, while tuberculosis slowly consumed its victims from within, earning the grim nickname, the wasting disease. Influenza struck in devastating waves, and dysentery turned the simple act of eating into a potential death sentence. What made these diseases so particularly devastating in medieval times was the complete absence of medical understanding that we take for granted today. Without knowledge of germs, bacteria, or viruses, medieval physicians operated in a world of dangerous ignorance. They attributed illness to an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, leading to treatments that were often more harmful than the diseases themselves. Bloodletting was prescribed for nearly every ailment, weakening patients when they most needed their strength. Physicians would apply leeches or make deliberate cuts to drain what they believed was corrupted blood, hastening death rather than preventing it. Other common treatments included purging the bowels with violent laxatives, inducing vomiting, and exposing patients to extreme heat or cold to rebalance their humors. The lack of sanitation created perfect breeding grounds for disease. Medieval cities were cesspools of human and animal waste, with garbage and sewage flowing through the streets. People lived in close quarters with their livestock, sharing cramped spaces where fleas, lice, and rats thrived. Wells and water sources were frequently contaminated, turning the basic necessity of drinking water into a game of chance with one's very life. Personal hygiene was virtually non-existent among the general population. Most people bathed perhaps once or twice a year, if at all. The wealthy might wash their hands and faces occasionally, but the concept of washing to prevent disease was completely foreign. Clothing was rarely cleaned, and people often wore the same garments for months on end. creating walking incubators for parasites and pathogens. Medieval hospitals, run primarily by religious orders, were places where the sick went to perish rather than recover. These institutions were more concerned with the spiritual welfare of patients than their physical healing. The dying were packed together in large halls where diseases spread like wildfire from bed to bed. The primary medical intervention was prayer, supplemented by herbal remedies of dubious effectiveness. The psychological impact of living under the constant threat of disease cannot be overstated. Medieval people developed a fatalistic worldview where death could strike at any moment without warning or reason. This uncertainty permeated every aspect of life. From family planning to economic decisions, parents could not reasonably expect their children to survive to adulthood, and marriages were often cut short by sudden illness. The economic consequences were equally devastating. Entire trade networks collapsed when plague struck major cities. Agricultural production plummeted as farmers perished in the fields, leaving crops to rot unharvested. Skilled craftsmen and their knowledge disappeared overnight, setting back technological and cultural progress by generations. The social order itself was constantly disrupted as disease claimed nobles and peasants alike. Though the poor inevitably suffered disproportionately, religious faith both sustained people through these ordeals and sometimes made them worse. Many viewed disease as divine punishment for wrongdoing, leading to extreme acts of penance that further weakened immune systems. Flagellant movements saw people whipping themselves bloody in public displays of repentance. Members of minority groups were scapegoated and persecuted during plague outbreaks, blamed for poisoning wells or bringing divine wrath upon communities. Yet even in this landscape of medical ignorance and suffering, there were glimmers of progress. Some medieval physicians began to observe patterns in disease transmission, laying the groundwork for future understanding. The concept of quarantine emerged during plague outbreaks, with infected ships forced to wait offshore before entering ports. Hospitals, despite their limitations, represented early attempts at organized medical care and established precedents for institutional healing. The diseases of medieval times were democracy's great equalizer, striking down monarchs and peasants with equal ferocity. They shaped migration patterns, influenced religious thought, and drove technological innovation as people sought any means to protect themselves. These invisible enemies were as powerful as any army, capable of toppling kingdoms and reshaping the map of Europe. The legacy of medieval disease extends far beyond the Middle Ages themselves. The trauma of repeated pandemics left deep cultural scars that influenced art, literature, and philosophy for centuries. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic motif, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life to their graves. This memento mori served as a constant reminder of mortality's universality and the futility of earthly pretensions. Understanding the disease environment of medieval Europe helps us appreciate not only how far medical science has advanced, but also the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Despite facing threats that would seem apocalyptic by modern standards, medieval people continued to build, create, love, and hope. They developed coping mechanisms and social structures that allowed communities to survive even the most devastating outbreaks. Their struggle against these invisible enemies laid the foundation for everything we know about public health today. From the ashes of medieval medical ignorance eventually arose the scientific method, germ theory, and the sophisticated medical infrastructure that protects us now. The suffering of our ancestors was not in vain if it teaches us to value and protect the hard-won knowledge that keeps such horrors at bay. The medieval era was a time when survival itself was a daily battle. And nowhere was this struggle more evident than in humanity's relationship with disease. While today we might complain about a common cold or worry about a stomach ailment, our medieval ancestors faced an entirely different reality, one where invisible enemies lurked in every breath of air, every sip of water, and every morsel of food. Picture, if you will, a world without antibiotics, without vaccines, without even the most basic understanding of what causes illness. Imagine living in a time when a simple cut could lead to death, when childbirth was a life-threatening gamble, and when entire communities could be wiped out by diseases whose names we barely remember today. This was the harsh reality for millions of people across medieval Europe, where death was not just a distant concept, but a constant companion that could arrive without warning. The medieval understanding of disease was a fascinating mixture of superstition, religion, and crude observation. Most people believed that illness was caused by bad air or miasma, a theory that would persist for centuries. They thought that foul odors and corrupted atmosphere were the primary culprits behind the spread of disease. In reality, of course, it was often the very conditions that created these bad smells: poor sanitation, crowded living quarters, and contaminated water sources that provided the perfect breeding grounds for the pathogens that would claim so many lives. The concept of contagion was poorly understood, if at all. People might notice that diseases seemed to spread from person to person, but they had no idea why or how. Some attributed it to divine punishment for wrongdoing, others to the alignment of celestial bodies, and still others to the corruption of the air itself. This lack of understanding meant that efforts to prevent disease were largely ineffective, often based more on hope and ritual than on any scientific foundation. Medical knowledge in medieval times was a patchwork of ancient Greek and Roman texts, Islamic scholarship, folk remedies, and religious doctrine. The works of Galen and Hippocrates were still considered authoritative, even though many of their theories were fundamentally flawed. The dominant medical theory was that of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were thought to govern health and disease. According to this theory, illness occurred when these humors became imbalanced, and treatment involved trying to restore equilibrium through various means, many of which were more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting was perhaps the most common medical procedure of the time, prescribed for everything from headaches to heart problems. Physicians believed that removing blood would help rebalance the humors and cure the patient. In reality, this practice often weakened already sick individuals, making them more susceptible to infection and death. Similarly, purging through induced vomiting or diarrhea was thought to rid the body of corrupted humors, but instead often led to dangerous dehydration and further complications. The tools and techniques available to medieval physicians were primitive by today's standards. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, making it an agonizing and often fatal procedure. Instruments were crude and often reused without proper cleaning, spreading infection from patient to patient. Many surgical procedures that we consider routine today were simply impossible, and even minor operations carried a high risk of death from infection or shock. Herbal remedies formed the backbone of medieval medicine, and while some of these treatments had genuine therapeutic value, many were based more on superstition than science. The doctrine of signatures, for example, held that the divine had marked plants with signs indicating their medicinal uses. So a plant with heart-shaped leaves might be used to treat heart problems, regardless of its actual pharmacological properties. While some herbs did contain active compounds that could help treat certain conditions, the hit-or-miss nature of this approach meant that patients were just as likely to be harmed as helped. The role of religion in medieval medicine cannot be overstated. Religious teachings held that illness was often a punishment for wrongdoing or a test of faith, and many people believed that prayer and penance were more effective than any earthly remedy. Pilgrimage to holy sites was thought to cure disease, and the relics of saints were believed to have miraculous healing powers. While faith could provide psychological comfort to the suffering, it did little to address the underlying causes of disease. This religious framework also influenced how medical care was provided. Many hospitals were run by religious orders, and the focus was often more on spiritual care than physical healing. The sick were seen as an opportunity for the healthy to practice religious charity, and caring for them was considered a sacred duty. While this meant that some basic care was available to the poor, it also meant that medical treatment was often secondary to spiritual concerns. The typical medieval hospital bore little resemblance to modern medical facilities. They were often little more than hospices, where the sick could perish with dignity rather than places where they might actually recover. Conditions were frequently unsanitary, with multiple patients sharing beds and little attention paid to preventing the spread of infection. The sick, the dying, and sometimes even the deceased might be found side by side, creating an environment that was more likely to spread disease than cure it. For the vast majority of medieval people, medical care was a luxury they could rarely afford. Professional physicians were expensive and primarily served the wealthy, while most common folk had to rely on local wise women, barber surgeons, or their own knowledge of folk remedies. These healers often had more practical experience than university-trained doctors, but they lacked access to the best available knowledge and resources. The barber surgeons occupied a unique position in the medieval medical hierarchy. Originally, these were simply barbers who, in addition to cutting hair and shaving beards, performed minor surgical procedures like tooth extraction and bloodletting. Over time, some became quite skilled at these tasks, but they were still considered inferior to university-trained physicians. The famous red and white striped barber pole actually originated from this practice, the red representing blood and the white representing bandages. Women played a crucial role in medieval healthcare, though their contributions were often overlooked or dismissed by male-dominated medical institutions. As midwives, they assisted with childbirth and cared for women's health issues. As wise women or herbalists, they maintained knowledge of medicinal plants and home remedies. Many women became skilled healers through necessity and experience, but they were also vulnerable to accusations of harmful practices if their treatments failed, or if they were too successful, and thus seen as threatening to established medical authority.